way away from you. You seem a long, long way away from us. If there's anyone who'd like to make the occasion cozier, bring a little bit more reassurance to the stage, if you'd like to come down and sit a little closer, I think we'll have a more focused conversation. So anyone who's right up the back who wants to come a bit closer, please do. I'm Jasmin Stephens. I'm an independent curator, and I'm here at the art fair with the UNSW guides who are giving guided tours. So after this afternoon's discussion, rush out and meet the UNSW guides. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the panel discussion and to be joined here by Clare Milledge. No. Welcome. Come and sit in one of the rows closer to the front, as I was just saying. We're here for understanding the wider ecology for your practice, and I'm joined by Clare Milledge, Ramesh Mario Nithiyendran, and Nina Miall. The fair has now been underway for several days. They were talking about matching hairstyles, but from what I can gather, they've taken matching painkillers. A few days into the fair, working on the stands, working the foyer, so they're all pumped to go. It's great to be here with you. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands we're meeting, and acknowledge elders past and present. We're here to consider different ways to develop and achieve rewarding work in the contemporary art sector. There are probably some people here who are saying, you must be kidding, but we're going to have a go at it. And what we're going to do this afternoon is talk about some questions which I hope will inform those of you who are here because you're curious about the workings of the art world. When we come to an event like Sydney Contemporary, we can feel like an outsider looking into an inner circle. You can feel that the art world is a circle, or perhaps a space where there is an inside and an outside. Or perhaps you're feeling that perhaps the art world is like a ladder and that you're stuck somewhere at the bottom. So what I want to do this afternoon is talk about a differently shaped art world. I'm not sure what kind of shape it is, but I think the inside and the outside and the ladder, they've had their day. We're going to talk about some other possibilities. So before we do that, I'm going to introduce Clare, Ramesh, and Nina. And we have a few slides to set the scene. So as I speak about each one of them, James will show some images of what these three colleagues of ours have been doing in the last couple of years. So Clare, who I often think of as a kind of special witch, produces installations that feature performance, textiles, and painting. Her painting involves a technique in which oil paint is applied to the reverse side of glass and then scraped away. And Clare believes that glass has the capacity to combine a sharpening clarity with darker, murkier content. Her PhD was entitled The Artist, Shaman and the Gift of Sight. Clare undertook part of her bachelor's and PhD studies in Oslo and Berlin, and she remains actively engaged with Norwegian contemporary art. Clare is a lecturer at UNSW Art and Design and she conducts her work in Sydney and in northern New South Wales, where she grew up. In a story for Arts Hub, I recently read that Clare describes herself as an artist, a body painter, and a burlesque performer. She is represented by the commercial, and her work is in the collections of Art Bank, Monash University Art Museum, and 10 Cubed. So welcome, Clare.
Thank you.
Ramesh. Ramesh is engaged in creating a heavily textured and rowdy cosmology inhabited by godlike figures. For those of you who know Ramesh, you'll know he loves a monument. His works are often stacked to form totems or perched on customised plinths. Ramesh, who was born in Sri Lanka, makes frequent appearances in his work, and the presence of female and male organs in the work reflects his use of source material from pornography, fashion, and art history. His inclusion in the recent 2018 Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh has led to forthcoming opportunities in Jaipur in India. Ramesh is also a lecturer at UNSW Art and Design, and he has described himself as working from a confident atheist position, but at the same time recognising that his work draws on his Hindu and Christian heritage. He's represented by Sullivan and Strump, Sydney and Singapore. Welcome, Ramesh. And then Nina. Nina is an independent curator and art consultant who lives in Sydney. She's pursuing projects in Australia and internationally that build on her experiences in London, Singapore, and Sydney. In introducing Nina, as I introduce Ramesh and Clare, I'm conscious that they're doing all of these things simultaneously. So Nina has been head of public programs at the Royal Academy. She was director with Haunch of Venison, the commercial gallery across Europe and America. And closer to home, Nina was founding director of Future Perfect Gallery, located in Singapore, which during its 3-year program presented its roster of artists in a critical and international context. Here at Sydney Contemporary, we're now enjoying the contemporary installation section, which Nina has developed and installed. And walking around the fair, considering the way that Nina has cited the work, I can see that she has really drawn on her experience working at this venue as a member of the curatorial team, which Nina did for several years. So welcome, Nina.
Thanks, Jasmin.
Now, we have some questions this afternoon. This title, Understanding the Wider Ecology for Your Practice, obviously suggests the first question. So if I could put it to you, Clare, is it useful to think of the art world as an ecology? And if so, why?
Ecology is a word that I would normally associate with botany and zoology and types of Western science models. So I have some problems thinking of it in the way that it's often used today, but I do understand why it's used, and I think it's used as a structure or a system because it talks about affinities and connections and relationships with things, but I kind of prefer to think about it more, I suppose, as a family, or which may also have like classification or Western science model similarities, but as the art world is a series of families or groups or social systems, if you like. So that seems to be the way that I would think about it, more so than an ecology.
And has it been a recent sense of how you wish to describe the art world as a family? Have you always thought of it that way, or has it been something that's emerged recently?
No, I think I've always thought about it like that. It's those relationships that you might forge or form with people that might last for a very long time that have become the most important for me, but perhaps I've become more aware of the idea of that as a family in recent times as those connections have led to opportunities or larger kinds of productions or exhibitions, etc.
So Claire, you're focusing, it seems, on the emotional dimension.
Yes.
And the supportive and sustaining dimension of the family. There must be a few tantrums, though.
I hadn't really thought about it like that. Yeah, I suppose.
Well, there are always tantrums in families.
Yeah.
Well, in mine.
I guess I haven't really thought about it so much in terms of people not getting along, but I suppose that is a way of thinking about it in some way, in that, you know, you might not approach or engage yourself with others that you don't potentially wish to collaborate with. And for sure, like, you do have to make decisions as you go along when people might ask you to do something with them and you actually have to say no because of said tantrum issues. But
well, maybe we'll come back to not getting along. And so over to you, Ramesh. Have you found it useful to think of the art world as an ecology? I'm interested in the art world as an ecology because it's certainly a shift away from the centrality of the human subject. But what about you?
I think, for me, I think looking at it as an ecology... Is my mic fine? Yeah? Okay, I'm nice and loud. For me, I don't really come at it with that knowledge of botany and the kind of scientific framework in which it's pitched, but I think working with institutions, what you find is, I guess, if we use an example, the production of an exhibition isn't just artist and curator, it's artist, curator, public programs, sometimes an external marketing company, studio assistants, install team. Then, you know, the exhibition opens and it's public, it's media. And I think all these kinds of different factors working together is what makes a contemporary art kind of discourse or landscape. And for me, I think it's that kind of practical, multi-dimensional aspect that makes it an ecology. And I think, you know, when you think about something like erosion, you know, it happens due to a multitude of factors and that leads to a number of things. And that's kind of how I look at it. But I think it's similar in that family respect, in that it's not so much a hierarchical relationship between artist, curator, gallery. It's a lot more complex and involves a multitude of, I guess, stakeholders, you could even say.
So Ramesh, you're actually speaking in terms of function, and you're actually talking about people in the art world being useful to each other.
Yeah.
And you, Nina, have you given any thought to the idea of the art world as an ecology?
Yeah, I have, certainly. And I think what's already been said about it being a kind of network of relationships and processes is very true. To draw out Ramesh's kind of environmental metaphor, I was reading about this kind of shift in environmental thought, you know, in the past 10 years with the kind of advent of the understanding of the Anthropocene, that, you know, they've moved from very siloed kind of disciplinary thinking, you know, whether it's geology or chemistry or whatever it is, to kind of earth system science, which understands the earth as this kind of very dynamic, evolving totality made up of these kind of interlocking or intersecting ecologies. And I think as we move in an increasingly globalized sphere, you know, the art world, in inverted commas, is almost made up of a number of these kind of ecologies, which intersect in different ways.
Well, getting back to a very basic definition of ecology, which is why we actually gave the program this title, ecology is the study of how organisms interact with one another and with their physical environment. And I think the most important thing about it is that if one thing changes in the ecology, it affects everything else. And the other thing about the ecology, of course, is that it doesn't necessarily assume a hierarchical relationship, a ladder, a circle with an inside or an outside. So if we could go back to your family metaphor and your idea of working with people who support you and nurture you, Clare, what kind of family are we talking about, but relating it to the art world? Are you someone that likes to work with people who are close to you? Do you continue to work with the same people over a long period of time? When do you get to a point where you feel you need to reach out and start to work with a new collaborator or bring someone into your life who's going to stimulate something else?
Yeah, well, I guess when I think about it as a family, I think about it in terms of finding a family as well. So finding a family, like you may not actually meet them in person, but finding some kind of group of people who might be interested or working in a similar area to what you're working in. So I always remember the first time I saw this installation in 2006 at the Berlin Biennale, and I felt like I'd found part of my family, which was this very, very dirty installation by Kai Althoff and Lutz Braun, and it was filthy. It was filthy dirty, and I've been told all my life, your work's too filthy dirty, you have to clean it up. And so when I first saw this thing, I felt like I'd met part of my family, and then it became a journey to see what those connections will be. So it's not just about who's supporting you in terms of like maybe giving you money or giving you a show or whatever, but who's working within these particular areas or interests as well. But in terms of collaborators and how that might continue, I often, like I'll go and see somebody perform, or I'll see something or happen to read something, and then I'll think, oh yes, they're part of the family, but it's not so much that I necessarily get along with them in that way. As you say, maybe you're having, arguments with them. It's not always about just social relations. It's about that sort of deeper connection, that's something about a visual language that you're connecting with. So that's what I mean, I suppose, about family. But that doesn't mean to say that you won't have wonderful friends along the way that you will continue to work with your whole life.
And that journey that you felt might begin at the Berlin Biennale with other people who really wanted to get their hands dirty and be really mucky as well. Does that journey continue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the people that I tended with are still colleagues of mine, and we still work together. So, it's always continued. But I come back to these points all the time as well, and I think that really had an impact at that time and helped me find that. I mean, you can call it family or ecology or whatever, and perhaps it's more ecological because there was a sense of decay in the air at the time as well as growth. But yeah, it's about finding these spaces, and sometimes you can't really put words to it.
And Ramesh, you're painting a picture which is quite organisational. I don't think we'll put the organisational chart up, but thinking about organisations and knowing what you're like, where's the wiggle room, or where are the diagonal relationships in some of these organisations that you've worked with? Because you are someone who has enjoyed solo exhibitions in quite a few major institutions.
Okay, well, I think what's an interesting point about this idea of an ecology as a family, there's this element that you can't choose your family. But I think in the art world there's a sense that in a way you're kind of lumped with some peers. But at the same time you can choose who you want to work with a lot of the time as well. You know what I mean? And I think that's really good. And I guess for me, one of my principles at least, when I approach a show that may be big and institutional, is to be professional and good to work with. I don't know if that was your experience,
That
Nina.
was absolutely my experience.
And I think...
No, and I just add that having worked with a number of difficult artists over the years, it's now quite an important criteria.
So Nina, just to fill us in, Ramesh, when were the two of you working together?
So Nina was curating the 2017 version of the National with Lisa Havilah at this Carriageworks venue, where I presented an installation there. But I think,
Carry on.
but I think this idea of these diagonal connections is really kind of interesting. Because I think if you're privileged enough to show at a venue that's that has high traffic or high footwork, so lots of people are actually looking at the exhibition, I think those are in some ways when the diagonal kind of relationships emerge. But what I've found, I guess, is that often a follow-up or contact is usually generated if there's some kind of intermediary that functions as a character reference. Like, I don't know, like, oh, I know that curator, I'm going to call them up. Is Ramesh horrid? And they'll say no, and then they'll be like, great. And I think looking back when I was asked to reflect on some of these issues, there have been lots of incidents where curators have called other curators who I have worked with previously to kind of get the lowdown. And I think that's also a basic social principle. People do that in the world. You know, if you're looking for a flatmate, you might look on Facebook, see who your mutual friends are, and be like, what's their vibe? And I think those kinds of fundamental principles around social interaction and harmony and disharmony have a lot of value and significance, especially in an art context where people are often presenting very personal work.
Which leads to our next question, and Nina, I'm going to ask you first. I asked each of the panellists before coming today if they would be prepared to describe an example of where the process of developing and caring for these networks, which we find in this ecology that we're part of, has led to an opportunity. And I did say that they could be as general or as specific as they wish to be. So over to Nina.
Well, it's happened countless times. I mean, I think the whole currency of the art world is social relations. So, you know, even this gig at Sydney Contemporary, I guess, came out of an association with Barry and you know, over many years. And
Barry is?
Barry Kildulas, the fair director.
Just in case, yes.
And he was obviously aware that I'd worked at Carriage Works, so I had this familiarity with the spaces, and I was now working independently. And yeah, I didn't kind of seek the opportunity out. I didn't kind of cultivate it in any way. I think networking is quite a kind of dirty word, and it sounds very kind of calculated and strategic and self-serving. And so maybe it's a bit outmoded for the kind of socializing that happens in the art world. I think, you know, the projects that I've done and the artists that I've worked with have emerged from very kind of real conversations where, you know, we've discovered a common ground or kind of synergistic interests or whatever it is, and built on that and decided to collaborate on something together. I think Ramesh's point is quite an interesting one, especially in the contemporary art world, and particularly when you're doing a lot of commissioning of new work. As a curator, it can be a little anxiety-inducing because you put your name on this show and you commission this new work, but you often don't know what you're actually going to get until a week or two before the show, sometimes the night before. So it is important that you have faith in the artist and in their process, and I think that's why curators certainly often when they get a big gig like a Biennale, will go to their favourite artist that they've worked with. They have that history, they have that trust and that faith, and they know that that artist will deliver on what is quite an important stage. Yeah.
And Nina, you mentioned having those real conversations over time through which opportunities are generated. This is very obvious, but tell us a bit more about the relationship between those real conversations and developing the trust that you need to have when you commission new work.
I think they happen so naturally and organically in the course of what you do. They happen. I'll do a lot of studio visits that have no kind of real agenda beyond giving me a kind of better familiarity with an artist's practice and getting a sense from them as to what their motivations are.
And may I ask, in that situation, when you do approach an artist about doing a studio visit, and it might be that they don't have a studio, so it could be a kitchen table visit, or it could be a chat under a tree next to a pool. These are all studio visits that I have done recently. Up front, are you saying, look, there isn't a specific project involved, I'd like to learn more about what you're doing? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, it often might have come about because I've seen their work in a show and it sort of interested me. And yes, I don't have a particular project with them in mind necessarily, but I'm interested in learning more. I just, you know, they're quite open-ended, I think. I just, you know, write to the artist and say I'd be interested in coming and kind of, you know, doing a studio visit, getting to know your practice. Yeah. It's almost more awkward when you do have a big project, like say the National, and you know, you have that in mind, and you want to do a studio visit with that in mind, but then for whatever reason they're not going to fit with the curatorial premise of the show, or you know, and it doesn't lead anywhere.
And Claire, would you be willing to speak to us about an example where the process of developing and caring for these networks that we've all spoken about have led to an opportunity?
Yeah, so like Nina, there's all of my opportunities have come from these types of situations. Is my mic working? Yeah. But just I suppose like the most obvious example would be last year. I had 2 exhibitions in Norway, one at the Museum of Contemporary Art. It was a performance, and the other one was actually some of the images from that were shown earlier, and then another one was sort of the window of the Photo Galleria, which is sort of like the leading photo gallery in Oslo for sort of contemporary photography. That's government funded, and both of those opportunities came through a trip that I did in 2006, the same time as the Berlin Biennale that I was referring to before, and I met, I suppose, my Norwegian art family, and all of those people sort of have provided me with these opportunities over the time, because we've continued to work together to maintain contacts. They've come over here, I've gone over there, and we continue to kind of plan these sort of projects together. And I imagine that will continue, but it is the care for those networks or the care for that family that kind of continues to provide those opportunities.
And any thoughts about that word, networking?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why it does have a sort of bad name. And when I think about the idea of networking, it's something that you might have to do as work, perhaps at your exhibition opening or whatever, when you've got to cover the floor and, you know, talk to all of the people, and your gallerist is there in the corner going, go over there, and your mum's going, there's this really rare bird outside, go and look at it. I'm like, shut up, I've got to work. So those are the associations that I make with network. I think they are important, but to me they're quite superficial and sort of, they're not really kind of like entering far below the surface in many ways, but I suppose they're essential.
And Ramesh, an example of things that are being generated through developing and caring for your networks.
Okay, I've got a couple, but they're linked. So I think it's also interesting to kind of frame it back to experiences in art educational context. And I think lots of the networks that are developed often kind of exist in that kind of university environment. Like I remember going to Tess Alice's office. She's over here.
She's in
and I remember she was looking at my work when I was a master's student and just kind of sending texts to Glenn Barclay and Lisa Havilah being like, I think you'd love this work. And then a few years later, they had that kind of familiarity.
And Lisa and Glenn are?
Lisa Havilah, Director of Carriage Works. Glenn was the Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the MCA at the time. But now I kind of work with Glenn as well. And so and I think those kinds of relationships and they're often intergenerational, especially with artists who are at an early stage of their career. I guess because people who are more experienced are actually able to advocate for artists who are, I guess, starting out, because they've had the years of experiences to kind of solidify those networks, and they've built the trust to recommend people to those people. But I think the other avenue, which I think is often mystifying for people, is how Australian artists are often able to get opportunities overseas. And like the one thing that I think actually people are often like, how did the Dakar Art Summit come about?
And just tell us briefly what the Dakar Art Summit was, because Claire also participated. Okay.
So the Dakar Art Summit is a platform for the presentation of South Asian contemporary art, held in Dhaka in Bangladesh. So that was a co-commission with ArtSpace, and Michelle Newton's
in the
rep
front
in the
row.
audience in purple.
Yes,
Deputy director. Anyway, that came about because I had a little feature in Art Asia Pacific online, and the artistic director saw that, reached out to me. Then I saw on Instagram that Alexi Glass-Cantor, the director of ArtSpace, was at that Dakar Art Summit 2 years earlier. So I said to her, "Hey, what was that like? Because I've been approached to be in it." And she went, "Oh, we should do a co-commission." And then and the project kind of grew through that kind of relationship. But I had a prior relationship with ArtSpace through exhibiting in the Emerging Fellowship exhibition as well. So it was in terms of ecology and non-linear and round, and do you know what I mean? You kind of really see how those relationships actually kind of generate these tangible outcomes. And speaking of kind of tangible outcomes, I guess with ArtSpace's support, we were able to grow, I guess, the funding around the project, publicity around the project, and I was actually able to focus on kind of developing ambitious physical work because the co-commissioning process meant that poor Michelle had to deal with the shipping, which was a nightmare.
And we're at Sydney Contemporary. I certainly feel like you stand out. How's the networking going this fair?
Oh, God. I think networking is interesting. I think people often associate it with a kind of corporate sensibility. But I think it's fundamentally about visibility. And I think it's also, I think we also need to question this idea of networking as well, because I think certain kinds of people are able to lend themselves to this networking process with more ease than other, whether it be to a personality kind of thing, or whether it be that they're from a higher socio-economic background, that they have time to go to these things, or whatever.
Hang around at these things,
exactly,
rather than rushing to their jobs like my students.
Exactly.
That's right.
And I think if you're able to network, it's actually a bit of a privilege, because it means you have that time. But I think what I've kind of experienced is I'm more comfortable with doing it less and less at the moment, but kind of being a bit more, so in a situation where I will have to represent myself, I'll be quite focused, but the majority of my time at the moment is spent in the studio.
Well, hopefully, when you were listening to my introductions of Nina, Ramesh and Claire, I was hopefully you picked up on the fact that I was emphasising one of the themes of our discussion, and that is that all three of them are striving to work locally and internationally at the same time. And part of working across time zones and working with colleagues who you may know or not know in different parts of the world, I think working in that way, there is a pressure to feel like you have to be continually connected. And so what I want to speak to the panellists about now is there a pressure to be continually connected? And being located in a situation like Australia, what kinds of connectivity do you regard as essential? So Nina.
Yeah, I certainly feel the pressure to be kind of continually connected, but I think everyone feels that. I think the advent of email and things, and the pace of contemporary life, and the fact that everything is 24/7 these days, it's kind of symptom of a larger malaise, I'd say. I have a very ambivalent relationship with social media. A lot of curators are kind of encouraged to run Instagram accounts, you know, as professional tools. And increasingly, I see, I hope, I don't think I'm guilty of it. It's not the way I like to work. But I do see curating happening, you know, via social media.
And what do you mean by that, curating happening via social media?
Well, look, it's an introduction, I guess, to an artist practice, and you need those introductions somehow. Either it's a recommendation from a peer, or you encountered their work in an exhibition, or maybe it's an image on Instagram that's somehow come up in your feed or something, and then you've gone to dig deeper. And I think that's the important thing, that we don't all operate in these. I mean, any curator builds up this visual library and visual record, and that's basically what you draw on when you're, you know, thinking about developing a show. So tools like Instagram are invaluable in certain respects, but I do think also you have to be very judicious about how, I mean, like with any media we consume, you have to be very judicious about where you're getting that information, who you're following. You know, if you have any intention of maintaining a perspective beyond the shores of Australia, it's important to factor that in and kind of, you know, follow international trends or institutions who are doing interesting things and artists overseas. So I think, yeah, you do have to be really judicious about kind of how you're consuming that media and where you're getting those sort of visual stimuli from.
And Claire, we were speaking about this pressure to be continually connected, and I know that you're from regional New South Wales, and at times you are based there conducting aspects of your work. So you must have a sense of the physical distance and the physical distance from where you're working here in Sydney and also in regional New South Wales, and the fact that you are so actively present, if not physically there, in Scandinavia. So what's happening in terms of your connectivity?
Yeah, I mean, I think I go through periods of like intense connectivity where I feel like I need to know what's going on and I need to be on Instagram and I need to do all of this, and then other periods where I feel like I need to be connected in a different way and maybe connected to my practice more. So I just spent almost 2 weeks in Central Australia with no phone coverage and no any kind of coverage really. And that was actually really great. And I was really worried that when I came out, like all of the students would be falling apart and the teachers and, you know, all of this university stuff would be really problematic, but actually it was completely fine. And it had all sort of sorted itself out. But I think we need to take time away from that feeling of connectedness sometimes to connect with other things. So I think this feeling, you know, sometimes like, oh, be connected, but you're just kind of like, you know, skimming along the surface and not really being that present. But, you know, coming from regional Australia and also like growing up with no electricity in a tent, like, and then realizing that, you know, if you're going to be an artist, you actually have to come and live in the city. I mean, that's sort of like an ongoing problem for me because I find it difficult to live in the city in many ways, but that's, you know, where you need to be if you're going to be, especially wanting to exhibit overseas or whatever, you need to be in the city as an artist. I think that's, you know, until you're, you know, properly established, and then you can rely on those networks that you've already established or the family that you've already established to some degree. Yeah.
And Ramesh, are you feeling the pressure to be continually connected?
I think there are different levels to that term. I think engaged might be a more interesting framework than connected, because I think it implies. I think if you're engaged in the industry, I think that kind of primarily leads to opportunities, connections, but then I think the question then is, what does engagement actually mean? And I think a key aspect of it is that it's proceeding in a way that isn't entirely self-interested. so that I think really good artists are often concerned with other artists' work and their peers' work in quite a productive, supportive way. But then I think there's this other kind of level where I think sometimes just the illusion that you're connected is enough. And I think social media sometimes functions to do that. You know, like if one artist has like X 40,000 Instagram followers, there's an illusion that they're connected and people might just assume that they are when they may have just paid for them. So I think there's a kind of whole a range of ways to approach it. But I think the thing I'm kind of thinking a bit more about now is sustaining my practice from a financial perspective. So what does it actually mean and look like to have a practice that has commercial viability and hopefully for a period of time? And how do you actually engage and network with markets, if I speak in kind of crude capitalist terms, to engage in that process? And for me, I think it's kind of focusing on, at this moment in my career, like international opportunities.
And that links into what you were saying, Claire, that you have a sense that you may become established and therefore have more choices about where you live and how you conduct yourself, wanting to have these regional connections as well as the international connections.
Yeah.
Have you had these conversations with what you term your art family in Scandinavia? What are they saying about this?
I told them I'm moving there in 10 years once my kids finish school. But I think they have it's different for them in a way because they're so close to all of those art centres. So you can live outside of Oslo, like in a rural environment and have a studio there, and then be very quickly in London or Berlin or putting a show together, whatever. So it is very different in Australia. In northern New South Wales, where I'm from, I've noticed a lot of more established artists moving up there and setting up their practice there. So Lindy Lee, for example, is quite local to where I was.
Lindy's showing with Sullivan and Strump and is also part of contemporary installation. Over to you again.
Yeah, so those types of things are possible, but it is about setting those systems up so that you're visible enough to be able to have opportunity, or you've got those networks set up so that you've already got the opportunity coming to you. You don't need to be on the floor so much, so to speak. So there is a lot of floor work that you do as a younger emerging artist. I think of it as floor work, which is
and
going to
where does
everything.
the term floor work come from? Why are you using
Come from
that
my
term?
head.
Is that about you? Is that about you being at the opening and your mother beckoning you to go outside and look at the birds?
That actually happened.
Okay.
That was at Griffith University, the art museum up there a couple of years ago, actually. It was like a rare bird or something, but anyway.
But you're sticking with this term, the floor work.
I feel like it is the floor because you are like literally moving across the floor, and I suppose I think of things quite materially being an artist, but it meant, like especially when you have a small child, it's like you've got a baby, but you go to the opening with the baby on your hip because you've got to be there and you've got to see the shows and you've got to talk to the people and you know what's going on, so to speak. It's not to say that you don't later as well, but it's almost about establishing an understanding of how things work at a sort of like, the base level is the wrong word, but setting something up so you've already kind of got that going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I think to wrap up, I think we need to continue talking about why these international opportunities are important. And so to you, Ramesh, you've said that there's a focus now on international opportunities. And I know that one of the talks during the fair is going to actually be asking the question, why are artworks cheaper here in Australia than in other parts of the world? But tell us more about this pursuit of international opportunities.
Okay. Well, I think if I speak personally, when I kind of started out, I kind of enjoyed quite a quick kind of level of traction, and maybe I might be a bit overexposed. So I think it's also about acknowledging that, and I think what's really something that we haven't actually mentioned and need to kind of foreground is that artists, the primary support of artists is money, and money gives them time to make their work and ease off certain pressures. And I guess whether it be through part-time work or if you have a commercial practice or through grant processes, I think being strategic and generating a kind of sustainable financial infrastructure around your work is probably a really important thing to do. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about at the moment. And I think, like, if I look at the kind of work I make, you know, I'll do the big kind of experimental installation works. But I also try and make sure that there are some works that can exist in more domestic contexts.
And are some of those, I haven't seen it yet, but are some of those works available at Sullivan and
Yeah,
Stump?
I think there's a couple left.
Great, a couple left. Carry on.
So I think the other thing is, because Sydney's so expensive to live in, people don't really have space to put sculpture. So if they collect in depth, it's like, where are they going to put all these sculptures? So I think on a very basic, pragmatic level, having, I guess, collectors overseas will actually allow you to make more work because you're engaging a wider market to generate more income to make work. Because I think, I know it's a bit funny. I think some people like to think that art and money sometimes we don't want to talk about that too literally. Because there's this belief that maybe we think art is this kind of pure form of expression. But I kind of think, in a way, it's good to have really transparent discussions around it, because I think that's what's going to sustain artists, being strategic about their incomes.
And Nina, you trained in Australia and then were based in London at the Royal Academy and then Haunch of Venison, which was spread quite across the world in 4 locations. Coming back to Australia, what are you going to bring to this conversation?
The first thing that struck me, and still strikes me, I've been back now for 6 years or so, but the first exhibition I curated on coming back, I was, the kind of curatorial framework for the show was already in place, and it was 24 artists, and 18 of them were Australian and 6 were international, and that was kind of how it was presented, 18 Australian, 6 international. And that struck me as a completely bizarre, firstly a bizarre sort of ratio, but also just that distinction between Australian art and international art, I have to say did sound very parochial coming from London, where you do a group show and you didn't know, you know, artists came from whatever city they came from, but you never thought in terms of how many were British and how many were international. And I do think we're still kind of slightly enthralled to this really reductive binary sense of centre and periphery. And I think we have an obligation to begin to work harder to understand ourselves as participating in an international, globalised art world. And I know that, you know, Clare and Ramesh are obviously doing that very successfully, and that's easier said than done. Our geographical location does prove impediments, and I think there's also a kind of cultural impediment where you know the work that is being made here is kind of similar enough to what is happening in, say, the States or Europe. It's not different enough to be exoticized as African art is or Latin American art is. It kind of occupies that space of somewhere like Canada, you know, culturally similar enough to the West, but, you know.
Some people have suggested Singapore to me.
Singapore, right? Oh, I disagree, actually. But, so I think, you know, there are obviously exhibitions like the APT that do that, the Asia Pacific Triennial at Quagoma in Brisbane that do that very successfully in terms of locating and situating Australian art as part of a broader regional conversation, Asia Pacific conversation. But I think we need to see more of that. And it is a balancing act because there is also an equally important responsibility to invest in and support and promote Australian art and the art being made on these shores, because we have, you know, modest population comparatively and a smaller market. And in order for it to be sustainable, there needs to be active investment in this. But I would like to see kind of more consideration of Australian art within a broader context.
Well, hopefully this afternoon, with Nina, Ramesh and Clare, we have engaged in a bit of shape-shifting. We've heard about some of the rewards and challenges associated with developing and caring for your networks. And as you can see from Nina's concluding remarks, we've been thinking a lot about the importance of working locally, nationally, regionally and internationally. And it is interesting to go out and to view that fair and to view your experience of the fair in the light of these kind of perspectives. So join me in thanking Nina, Ramesh and Clare.